Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Messinio.
And I'm Steven Sigman.
Welcome to the weekly movie throwdown. This month, we are doing adaptations of Elmore Leonard books. There have been quite a few, so we had to choose 4 that we think is a pretty good encapsulation of the good and the bad. This week, we're looking at Out of Sight, 1998 movie directed by Steven Soderbergh, starring George Clooney and Jennifer Lopez. I think this is a really good one to start with. It's the second movie kind of in a Elmore Leonard adaptation renaissance, but this one is one of my favorites, so I'm really excited to get into it.
It may only happen a few times in your life.
Not once.
And you always remember it because it was there and you let it go and you think to yourself, what if I had stopped? No bills off the bottom of the drawer, please. Is your first time being around? You're doing great. Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too.
I think you flooded it.
Get out of the car, sir.
Well, you're the reason, my friend, that I don't keep all my money in the bank.
You'd be surprised what all you can get and ask for it the right way.
2 men by the fence!
It's okay, we're the good guys.
What are you doing here?
You're just a girl. What do you do for a living? You pack a shotgun.
I'm a federal marshal and you're under arrest.
I'm in. Let's go. Hey, you comfy?
You have got to be kidding.
Now you be a good girl. Now I'm gonna open up the trunk.
You want to sit down and have cocktails with a woman who tried to shoot you.
It was an unusual experience.
Wow, you are mean.
Oh, what, one last score? Retire to some island, is that the idea?
Partial to mountains myself. If you like islands, we're picking an island.
I'm not exactly a 9 to 5 type.
Who is?
Happy birthday.
Oh my God, it's beautiful. Thanks, Dad.
Here, ma'am, let me help you with these.
Now, I didn't ask for your help, so don't expect a tip.
Oh, that's okay, ma'am. I'll just take your car.
I've vertically integrated myself. You know, now I'm into the occasional grand larceny, home invasion.
Huh. He waved at you?
Couldn't swear to it, but I'm pretty sure you did.
Did you wave back?
She's are shooting men.
Sit down, Dick. They're trying to open up the safe. Now you're made. Ever wear one of these?
I don't ski.
I'm a federal officer. I can't handle myself. We wanted to tussle. We tussled.
Whoops.
Damn it, Jack! Put the gun down!
You wouldn't do that
Oh, why not?
because you're having too much fun.
Smilers in the making. You gotta fight the powers that be. Got it, baby.
So what is Out of Sight about? The story is this. A career bank robber called Jack Foley escapes from a U.S. prison in Florida, and he takes U.S. Marshal Karen Sisko hostage on his way out. They're immediately attracted to one another, mostly because they're thrown in a trunk together, and George Clooney is George Clooney. And then she gets away. Clooney makes his way north to Detroit to rob a house where Albert Brooks lives, one of his counterparts in prison. She follows along. We don't know if she's going to arrest him or run away with him. That's kind of at the center of the film, is like, will they, won't they? So she goes to Detroit with him, or in pursuit of him, basically. And then they meet up. So they're basically like stuck together at the beginning, separate, constantly on a road back together. And then at the end, it's a little ambiguous, but you don't know whether they do or they don't. This was kind of a hot time for Elmore Leonard adaptations. We can get into that a little bit, but I really just want to kind of figure out why we're doing this. And I think it's because he's just so prolific, and there have been so many adaptations of his books. Up front, I'll say I've never read a single Elmore Leonard book or short story that I can remember, but I have seen just about every adaptation. So I think I could speak to that. And there's kind of a tone that runs throughout most of them anyway. And I mean, I think one of the things we want to talk about is how that's handled based on the director who's at the helm. But from the ones I've seen that I can remember, there's kind of a general tone that each director is able to like put his own spin on. And this one in particular is from what I recall of the ones I've seen, probably the best one. going back and revisiting it's quite a good film. And from what I've read about how Elmore Leonard writes, it seems like it's very true to his style of writing. So maybe that's why it comes across so well. I don't know. Are you an Elmore Leonard fan?
Yeah, yes, I am. I read a few of his books and watched pretty much everything that's connected to Elmore Leonard. And you're right in the fact that this one is not just one of the best, but it's important in that I think that it really sets the tone of the style of the Elmore Leonard crime adaptations, because he writes different kinds of books, and we'll get into Get Shorty, which is a bit more of a industry comedy type of thing, but he does write a lot of books about crime, cops and robber things. And this one very much sets a template for what you'll see when other people take on the Elmore Leonard crime universe. I mean, when you look at Justified, I think Justified owes a lot. That's the TV show that was made by FX, maybe in the 2010s, maybe a little earlier than that. But the tone of that, I think, you see takes a lot from the template that Out of Sight set up. And as you explore the universe, you'll as the years go on, you'll see a lot of that. I think that this movie gave a lot of people an idea of how to present Elmore Leonard on screen. So that's why it's important for that reason. But honestly, for a ton of reasons. This, when you go back and watch it, at the time that we saw it, you didn't realize what a seminal movie it would become, even though it wasn't very successful. But it changed everything for many of the people involved and gave other people almost a perfect way of how to adapt Elmore Leonard. I mean, the year before, of course, Quentin Tarantino had adapted Jackie Brown, which is similar, but it still is more of a Tarantino movie than anything else. I think it almost skews more Tarantino than Elmore Leonard, although he doesn't change the story all that much. But Soderbergh is less obviously in the mix of it and lets the story be. And that's very much the style that continues for people who adapt Elmore Leonard down the road.
It's interesting how last week we talked about Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels and mentioned how Tarantino was kind of a big influence on that. And it's just interesting how much, first, that we're looking at films around this time in the mid to late 90s, and just how much everybody tried to be Quentin Tarantino. So we can't really do a show without referencing him if it's something between like 1995 and 2005, which I find fascinating.
What's interesting with this one too is that they obviously knew that Tarantino was working on Jackie Brown, and Soderbergh had a conversation with him to discuss the fact they were both putting out adaptations of Elmore Leonard within a year of each other. But Tarantino, of course, told him, he's like, look, my movie is going to really be nothing like what you're working on. So I'm not really worried about it. It shouldn't be an issue. And it really wasn't. They are similar in some ways, but very different tones in terms of how the movie is presented. And a Tarantino movie is a Tarantino movie, so that's why he probably wasn't worried. But we can get into how important this movie actually was for Soderbergh, probably why he would want to check with Tarantino and make sure that his movie had a chance, because this was a pretty big deal for Soderbergh's career, kind of a make or break moment, I would almost say.
Yeah, he'd really been kind of on the skids since making Sex, Lies, and Videotape in '89. And I mean, that won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, and it was like huge at Sundance. So it really set him up to be this new promising director. And then between that and Out of Sight, he kind of made some clunkers. I mean, maybe not even clunkers. I mean, I find all of them to be at least somewhat interesting, primarily because I find him to be really interesting as a director and a writer. But he made Kafka with Jeremy Irons, King of the Hill, which I found to be pretty good. Schizopolis, which is actually one of my favorite films. I really, really love that because it's so batshit crazy and basically like starts with a disclaimer of Soderbergh talking to the audience and saying, look, if you don't get this, it's you, it's not me. I love the balls of that. And then, yeah, I mean, he also did Grey's Anatomy, and then he got this, and it just launched him. I mean, there were 10 years there almost where he was
in the wilderness.
Unsure.
Is the way,
yeah,
is the best way to put it. But yeah, and actually a stroke of luck, because the only reason he ends up getting this movie is because Barry Sonnenfeld had directed Get Shorty, very successful, he produces this movie, and the plan was very much for him to direct this one as well. But he got caught up in trying to finish Men in Black, which he was working on. So he didn't have time to do this. So they're searching for another director. A couple of other directors turn it down, and it just kind of falls down the ladder and it drops into Soderbergh's lap. He takes a meeting, is excited by the project, and he sells it and is able to get the job. And it really changes everything about his career once it comes out.
Yeah, and actually Clooney was attached when Soderbergh got it, and I think it's important to look at his career too and what Out of Sight meant for it, because he's coming off Batman and Robin.
Well, I actually looked at it. It's not just the fact he's coming off Batman and Robin, but I think that it's a really good example, and maybe even with Soderbergh, where people are trying to find their way. They're trying to find what works for them, but also can be commercially successful. And Soderbergh's stumbling, but he finds that this style of movie, in a way, it creates a lot of what he starts doing down the road, where he takes,
for sure,
he's doing commercial-esque kind of movies, but doing them in a really interesting style. And he still has his own little quirks and is able to make things interesting for himself, thereby making it interesting for the audience. And he ends up using that. I mean, even we get down to Ocean's 11 and you get to Logan Lucky and all these things where he takes all these movies that are fairly straightforward, but figures out interesting ways to film them or to present them, which keeps everything just a little bit off kilter. But getting back to Clooney, yeah, the two of them, I mean, almost everyone in some ways, it sets them up for the success they're going to have down the road. Clooney had been in ER, finally gets success there. And it, as far as I remember, it had been in like 3 movies up to this point. One Fine Day, your standard romantic comedy that a person like Clooney's going to end up doing. He does The Peacemaker, your standard action movie where they want to turn him into Harrison Ford. And then Batman and Robin, which the less said, the better. So it's just, again, this idea that no one really knows what to do with George Clooney. They think he's a standard movie star. They're trying to figure out what project to plug him into, and they're just not working. But Out of Sight gives Clooney exactly what it is that he's best at. He's kind of funny, but always very cool. He has a very casual persona that is able to project on screen, and he's not trying to do too much. And it just suddenly it's like the light comes on, and you immediately see what George Clooney is great at, and from there on, and I mean, it's off to the races at that point. So I think it's just incredibly important to understand that up to that point, no one really knew what to do with him, and Out of Sight gives you exactly the right thing to do.
I think a big part of that was him making that choice. I read an interview once where he talked about the power of a script. And when he did Batman and Robin, he said he read reviews of that, and he made a promise to himself that he would look at a script over what a film is. He said that you can make a bad movie from a good script, but you can't make a good movie from a bad script. And so I think the failure of Batman and Robin really got him thinking about it. And that's kind of in the middle of a run where he was starting to do some interesting things. Before Batman and Robin, he did From Dusk Till Dawn, which is a Robert Rodriguez film, Quentin Tarantino's script. He did The Thin Red Line in '98, the same year as this, which is a Terrence Malick film. He did the South Park movie, of course. Then he went on to do Three Kings in '99, a David O. Russell film. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou in 2000. And then he would go on and direct his own film in 2002 with Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, which had a Charlie Kaufman script. So I think what we're seeing is him realizing in '96 and starting to work with Robert Rodriguez, he can be in the mix in this world of all of these hot young directors, and he doesn't have to go the route of like Richard Donner or Joel Schumacher or whatever and make something big. But he starts to make this decision, and the stuff he starts putting out is incredible. I mean, even with this one, which is like right there at the front of it, working with Soderbergh, even when he's not Soderbergh yet, but like it's amazing. You can just visibly recognize a shift in Clooney's decision making when it comes to films, and I just think that's really cool.
Yeah, and you could say something similar for Jennifer Lopez. I think a lot of people were surprised that she ends up with this part, but she's wonderful in it. And up to this point, I mean, she'd done Selena, she did Money Train, which is another movie that I really couldn't stand. Uh, and what she did,
I should have
Jack.
left it at White Men Can't Jump.
Yeah, exactly. It was thrown to the well one too many times. So she done, she just done Selena the year before. She worked on Money Train. She did Blood and Wine, a movie with Jack Nicholson, which I mean wasn't particularly good. But she's kind of searching as well. Does Anaconda, I think, the year before too. I think she's trying to find her way. And Out of Sight allows people to see a side of her they hadn't really seen before, and really opens her up to a bunch of different parts, and also shows she can hold her own with anybody, and catapults her in almost into the A-list. And we know where she goes from there. So it's again an important movie for her.
Yeah, and she really, when you say she holds her own, that was a big selling point for Soderbergh, because the scene that he was auditioning with was the trunk scene, which is basically their meet cute, the Jack Foley character and Karen Sisko, the U.S. Marshal. And they were auditioning actresses, and Sandra Bullock was in at one point, and Soderbergh thought they had great chemistry, but not for an Elmore Leonard film. And eventually J-Lo came in, and what Soderbergh liked about her was that she was bringing something different out of Clooney than the other actresses were. And so that was like his selling point when he knew that she was going to be the right one for this role. And I think her energy and just like she owns it. And I don't know how the script was written, but the way that they introduce her early on and basically make part of the film her point of view, which I gather is kind of a trait of Elmore Leonard to have multiple points of view in his films, but introducing her early on, another actress might not have been able to handle the heavy lifting of carrying a storyline the whole way through a film like that. And I think she just pulls it off so well. And yeah, it leads to some great stuff for her. It's just such a good film for casting in general.
This is a murderer's row casting. When you have Viola Davis as a bit part that's almost forgotten, I'd actually forgotten she was in it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she has a 5-minute part in the movie. And when she's playing on the low man on the totem pole, it's like, Jesus, you have a really strong cast. Catherine Keener. I was also going to mention even Ving Rhames. I think that this is an important role for him as well. And I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into things, but I think that the part that he plays here, to me, is probably the reason he ends up getting Mission Impossible, which ends up being a long-running series for him, because I think that it shows a different side of him and allows him to not play the heavy or just play the straight bad guy, or be able to play kind of a sidekick but equal partner role, who's funny and engaging and knows what they're doing. And I think I find the roles to be very similar, and so I can't help but think that this opened up doors for him as well and probably got him that role.
Yeah, he's just one of a handful of people from the mid to late 90s independent world who are in this. When you have Steve Zahn, who like kicked it all off in Reality Bites. You have Luis Guzman, Don Cheadle, both worked with Paul Thomas Anderson the year before on Boogie Nights. Catherine Keener, as you said. You have Albert Brooks in a role where he looks just like George Costanza and is absolutely fantastic. Isaiah Washington, of course. I don't know. It's such a well-cast film.
Yeah, we can go on and on about the people. I mean, allow me now to continue talking about the cast. I mean, I could go on about Don Cheadle all day. I mean, up to this point, he'd only done a few roles as well. Not that they were in any way bad roles. I mean, Devil in a Blue Dress is not just one of my favorite movies, but one of my all-time favorite parts, playing Mouse in that movie. Don Cheadle is just... the fact that he almost steals the movie from Denzel Washington tells you everything you need to know about how good Don Cheadle is. And so he's in that. And then he does a made-for-HBO movie called Rebound about Earl the Goat Manigault, which, if no one's ever seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a heartbreaking story, but a really good movie. And Don Cheadle is fantastic in it. So, he's slowly bubbling up. But I think Out of Sight, it just is one of my favorite Don Cheadle parts, because he's everything that you need that character to be. He's kind of funny. not that bright, but also very smart about what he does, but also incredibly frightening. I mean, he's just has this air of menace that he's able to give off, which I just find electrifying, really. And he also has, spoiler alert, one of my favorite death scenes of all time. I mean, I rarely think about how people die, but the way that he falls in that movie, it's something I think about all the time. I'm like, was that a choice that he made? Was that just kind of a spur of the moment of how he kind of like hitches and then just kind of bends over? It's just so good. I rarely think about how people fall after getting shot, but even that he does really well.
I think it tops White Boy Bob's trip on the step and shoot myself in the face death, which comes right before it. Yeah.
And one more cast person, Paul Calderon is in this, and he's just one of those New York actors, kind of shows up in a bunch of TV shows. Of course, he's been in Law and Order a bunch of times, and he's been in tons of things. He's like a classic, that guy, where he's in a bunch of things. But interestingly enough, the part that he plays, Raymond Cruz, in this, he ends up reprising 25 years later. He actually comes back and plays Raymond Cruz again in the Justified City Primeval, which was the Justified reboot they did last year. And so that's fascinating to me. He actually comes back and plays that part again, but starts it here. But he ends up playing a bunch of cop roles, and he's in the Bosch TV show, another adaptation. That's Michael Connelly. But he's in all of those episodes of Bosch playing another cop. So he's just really good at playing a cop and lots of other things. He's just one of my favorite character actors. So it would be a shame not to mention him.
He's really great in just about everything. It also bears repeating or mentioning, since you said how he shows up on Justified, which I guess makes that a shared universe without a sight. Also showing up in this film is the FBI agent Ray Nicolette, played by Michael Keaton, who has a prominent role as the same character in Jackie Brown the year before. So I think it's all one big Elmore Leonard verse. And
that's a really smart thing to do as well. So what Soderbergh said, and I didn't double check this, I'll believe him. Why not? He said that he believes it's the first time that an actor has ever played a character in two separate movies that are unrelated. And that feels true, where he just kind of pops up and reprises the role, even though the movies really don't have any connection to each other. And that's a really cool thing that I wasn't aware of. But also the fact that Michael Keaton showed up and did it for free. He just did it as a favor. I think he just enjoyed playing the character and wanted to do something fun, and so he just flew down, did it in a day. And I really think that says a lot about Michael Keaton too. So there's two wonderful uncredited cameos, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Michael Keaton being one, and I apologize to anyone who hasn't seen this before, but I guess almost 30 years is probably enough. Sam Jackson also has a fantastic cameo in this movie. Also shows up for a day, does it for free. So I think, again, that shows you, like, we're talking about how good the cast is and what a seminal movie this kind of is for that period and where it spins off to. The fact that all these people kind of show up and want to be involved in it even for a day and do it for nothing just shows you what was happening in that moment as well. I think that everyone recognized it was a great script and just wanted to be part of it and thought it would be fun to work.
I mean, it feels a bit like the time of the 90s, the mid 90s through 2000, like the indie film world feels like the Seattle music scene of the early 90s to me. You have all these people just kind of showing up for one another, and it's pretty cool. And that's definitely the case here. So it just seems like they're having a lot of fun, and they're kind of doing some important stuff too. And as far as affecting Hollywood beyond this, Clooney and Soderbergh would go on to form a film company around this called Section 8, which would put out films by Christopher Nolan and Richard Linklater and Todd Haynes in the upcoming years, and Rob Reiner, and also a lot of their own films. They put out Good Night and Good Luck, Syriana, Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, the Ocean's films. So they're really kind of making a company to produce their own work but they're also bringing in these amazing auteurs. And I think that's really important. I mean, that sets up a lot of these directors to go on and do some pretty amazing things. So yeah, I mean, and Soderbergh has a kind of a reputation for championing filmmakers in this way. And I guess he built a company to kind of do that financially, which is fantastic. And thank goodness.
I believe I said this last week, but I will say it again. Man, this was really my favorite period of time for movies, this mid to late 90s period.
Yeah, it was a lot of, this is kind of when I learned how to watch film and how to really become a film buff.
Yeah, and on the note that we're talking about in terms of, you know, the importance of this movie in terms of what it does for everyone involved. So another person who's the composer, his name was David Holmes. And I looked it up. He started out as a club DJ and starts getting into film work. And this was only the third thing that he had worked on. He did work the TV movie and then worked on Out of Sight and another movie, both in 98. But this is another one where it just felt like nothing I'd ever really heard before. And I think the fact that he comes from a DJ background has a lot to do with why it sounds so different. And this is one of the few movies I went out and bought the soundtrack for. And even the way the soundtrack is sequenced with snippets of the movie, but it cuts from one song to another, and it shifts on you with hard stops. You know, everything about it is interesting. And I found the music in this movie to almost be another character. It's like nothing I'd ever really heard before, and I was fascinated by it. I love the way they mixed in the Isley Brothers songs, but the score itself was really fascinating, and I find myself playing it from time to time just because I like the ambiance of it. I like the mood. I just think it's really fascinating work. And of course, David Holmes ends up working on a bunch of different things, including working many times in the future with Soderbergh. So another guy that kind of Out of Sight makes him and sets him off where he's going to go.
Yeah, there were just heavy hitters all over this film. I mean, the music, the acting, of course, the directing, but a big role in it was the editing. I mean, part of why this film looks the way it is the editing. And the editor on it was Anne V. Coates, who is like legendary. I mean, she won an Oscar for cutting Lawrence of Arabia. So she's been around for a while and knows what she's doing. And I think her touches on this, as is the case with so many editors, which goes underappreciated, really make it what it is. And I think she, from what I understand of how Elmore Leonard writes in kind of like disjointed scenes and kind of a jumbled narrative, she really brings that to the screen. And yeah, it's just one more person involved in this who makes it such a great film. I mean, how could it not be excellent with all these people involved?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't consider myself a really nuts and bolts filmmaking kind of person. I mean, I notice things. I think you're a little better at that than me, and a little more nuanced in looking at it. But the techniques of this movie stood out to me and stand out to me. Like I'm taken by the fact that there's more wide shots than I'm used to seeing and more close-ups. You know, a lot of movies are that mid shot, and he doesn't really use that as much. He uses quite a few wide shots and close-ups. They change your perspective just a little bit, and I found myself recognizing that throughout the movie. And even the angles that were taken in the way that it was shot were interesting. And of course, there's the freeze frames, which he does talk about quite a bit about, for no particular rhyme or reason almost. It's just something he wants to do and works it into the movie. So those little freeze frame things, it's almost, him reminding you that you're watching a movie, which doesn't always work, but works here. It works with the style of the movie. It constantly kind of stops and reminds you what you're seeing. So all those little things I find myself noticing. And also even the color of the movie, where each of the prison scenes where Florida has a certain look, and the other prison has a different look because it's out in the desert, and that has a certain look to it. And then the shots from Detroit, which I just find amazing, all shot with that steel blue filter.
Mhm.
It gives it a completely different look that shows you that you're in a completely different place. And I don't always recognize those kinds of things, but in this case, it really stood out to me. I loved it. I just think it's those subtle things that he uses, the filters, and the way that he presents this movie is just another way that makes it highly watchable.
Yeah, the color thing is very important to him in this film, and it would actually go on to be a really prominent feature in Traffic the next year, for which he would win Best Director. But if you watch Traffic, it's almost like there's a blue screen and an orange screen and a yellow screen. It's really interesting. I think Aaron Brockovich does it a little bit too, but it's kind of come, at least in that period, to be his sort of trademark. I don't think the Ocean's films or other things beyond that do it quite as much, but it's very prominent here, and it seems like the beginning of it for him. And it's a great way to tell a story visually. I mean, I think it gives you a sense of place, gives you a sense of like the temperature of the place, of the things that are happening. So yeah, kudos to him for that. I really love that. And now in a world of like film colorization and adjusting temperatures, I don't know that he was like the first one to do it, but you see a lot more films adopting that style and creating a temperature for whatever the scene calls for. And yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, it's one of the neat things about post-production, I guess, to do that. So very cool.
Yeah, and also it made me realize watching this again that Justified, the TV show that most people who like Elmore Leonard have watched, they do a similar thing. I think that the look of Detroit is kind of taken from Out of Sight, and also he's in Florida. It feels very similar. So I have to imagine that they grabbed onto that color scheme from Out of Sight and end up using it in Justified. It's not exactly the same, but similar enough where it can't be a coincidence.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of become an Elmore Leonard thing, maybe. I mean, I think about like 3:10 to Yuma, which I think is one of the adaptations that's based on a short story of his, has similarly a very like tone heavy palette that defines what's happening. And yeah, those are the kinds of things I love to look at and figure out when I'm watching a film. And Soderbergh is just a master of these little tricks on screen, like the freeze frames and the colorization. There's a lot of cross-cutting with dialogue and scenes in this film too, which kind of goes back to Anne V. Coates, her editing. But I also think that's sort of his vision, and like the love scene in particular. He said he wanted to have it feel like they were in their heads, because when you're in the room, there's no dialogue. You're hearing what happens at the bar beforehand, and that's actually a nod to Nicholas Roeg's film Don't Look Back, and a love scene with Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, which is worth watching just because it's a crazy film, but not just for that scene. But it's very cool, and you do see a lot of that influence with Soderbergh here, even when Clooney and Lopez are in the car. They just start talking about films. Like as soon as they meet, they're talking about Network and Bonnie and Clyde. It's amazing. It's so cool. He has such a rich influence from film history in his work, and it's great.
Yeah, I love that trunk scene for Clooney as well, because it's the thing throughout most of the movie. He comes off very calm and cool, and in the trunk scene, that he's nervous. That's how he really likes her, because he's like a chatterbox. He's talking a lot, and of course he misquotes Network in a really funny way. He's just yammering on and on and on, but it seems very out of character for how he is in the rest of the movie, which is what shows you that he really likes this girl, and he's trying to figure out how to calm down around her. So Clooney's just really good in this part. One other thing about him I thought was interesting, one of the running themes is him playing with the lighter. Clicks it open, snaps it so it turns on. Apparently that was something that Soderbergh had seen George Clooney do at a party. That's something that he just used to do. And Soderbergh noticed it and ends up putting it in the movie because he thought it was kind of cool and thought it would work well. So that really wasn't part of the character. It's just something that George Clooney was able to do that they end up using.
One thing that he also does in real life that he had to act like he couldn't do in this film is play basketball.
That's right.
Which I would imagine is very upsetting to him to look bad on the basketball court. But he did it. Getting back to the trunk scene, which is what kicks everything in motion. I read that they initially wanted to do that in one shot, and they did, and then they test screened it, and audiences hated it. So I can't even imagine what that would look like as one shot. I mean,
well, here's a fun thing for you. If you get the DVD, that scene is actually in the extras. It's part of a bonus.
The one shot.
Yeah, so they actually put the one shot in the bonus section, so you can watch it and see exactly.
Oh wow! So where is the camera? How does it look?
It's not that dissimilar, to be honest. It's just
okay.
It's the lighting is slightly different, and the angle's a little bit different, but it's just really long. It's a really long scene, and they recognize that it just took people out of the movie. They couldn't figure out a way back in because it just dragged on. So so if you're interested in it, it's worth finding the DVD so you can watch it.
Okay, yeah, it must be online somewhere, I would think, but
that's
if
right.
not,
People who have better technology than I am, I'm sure you can find the clip online if you try hard enough.
Yeah, but it's good to own physical media. That we can do a whole show on that. Like, really, the film is a divergence. Like, these two come together at the beginning and then they diverge, but on their whole time apart, they're kind of coming back together. And I think what's cool about the way Soderbergh makes it and the way it's written, and we should also say that Scott Frank wrote this film with Soderbergh, who is just an incredible screenwriter. He's done a million things. He's written Logan, in particular,
right.
Minority
That's
Report.
Another good point. Up to this point, he had not done that many things. So for this, it's a huge breakout for him. So another person that this movie is really important for.
You know, he famously had a profile in the New Yorker about a month ago about just how hard it is to write things and how he makes like astronomical amounts of money every week being a script doctor. So I guess he kind of found his place after doing this, but it's not necessarily writing things that end up on the screen.
Well, I think it took him, quite a few years to find out what his real place was, but it turns out it was prestige television because he ended up making Godless and then The Queen's Gambit, which was really one of the best TV things I've watched in quite a long time. Really fantastic. And now he's working on that Sam Spade show for
Monsieur Spade.
Yeah, so I think that it took him a lot of years, but I think he found his wheelhouse, which was long-form television, long-form limited series television.
Gosh, just another success story out of sight.
Exactly.
It's pretty amazing.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's the thing for a movie. You think, oh wow, look at all this stuff. This movie must have been huge. I'm like, no, it wasn't. I guess we'll get to the numbers. We usually get to that at the end of the show, but we can talk about it then.
Yeah. Actually, it's probably a good time to get to that. But also, just to describe how it was received, the Rotten Tomatoes score, the critics, 94%. So it was pretty well received. I know Roger Ebert really had a love of this film at the time. And over the years, it's kind of stayed pretty good with the audience. That's a 74% audience rating. So not too bad. And yeah, getting into the box office numbers, I couldn't find a budget for it, but
I heard the budget was like 50 million or so. But I read that briefly somewhere. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Looking at the box office for the week this came out, June 26, 1998, it was kind of a weird time, a weird weekend. Number one was Dr. Dolittle, which brought in a whopping $29 million. Number two was Mulan with 17 million. Number three was The X-Files, down from number one in the week before with 13 million. Out of Sight coming in at number four with 12 million in box office, just beating out The Truman Show, which came in with 8.5 million that weekend. So it did pretty well in terms of what the box office was at that time, I guess.
Wow. So I will say it again. Just the fact that Doolittle came in ahead of Out of Sight and The Truman Show once again proves that parents will take their kids to see any garbage under the sun.
Also of note to me anyway, on this weekend, in a massive 2 theaters and grossing $40,000 at number 18 for the week is Vincent Gallo's film Buffalo 66, which if you haven't seen is just insane, like everything Vincent Gallo does, but it made $40,000. I'm impressed on 2 screens. That's commendable.
That might have been the highlight for that movie, possibly.
Yeah, it's an acquired taste. Terrific performance by Ben Gazzara, though, lip syncing to a record. Did you have any other little bullet points about Out of Sight that you wanted to bring up? Because I think we're kind of getting to the end here.
Yeah, well, what I did find interesting, we talked about the budget for this was around 50 million. The budget for Jackie Brown was only 12. So I just think that's interesting for me personally. So Tarantino, pretty good filmmaker.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think it was interesting to me of note was that in the prison scenes, those are all real convicts, and that supposedly led to some interesting interactions. But they said that Clooney actually was fantastic, like didn't hide in his trailer. He said that he really helped the film out by being out there and available and chatting with people, because if he'd have been more standoffish, Soderbergh was a little worried there might be some issues on the set. But turns out he was really available to everybody. So George Clooney, apparently a good guy. Just to reiterate, he was good with the convicts, he was good with the old people in the Florida scenes. So he just liked hanging out with people. So I just thought that was fun to know.
Do you think he's the antidote to Donald Trump? Like he's very politically active. His dad was a journalist. He's very well versed on, the things that are going on. Maybe he's the answer. He's very politician-like.
I think he's smart enough to know that he doesn't want to try to be the answer. So I think
that's true.
Yeah.
But when you told me he was just out there conversing with the convicts, I immediately thought, like, this is a campaign. He's definitely pressing the flesh and kissing babies, prison babies. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know if I have anything else. Oh, I will say this. When Elmore Leonard wrote this and he thought about who would be in the lead if a film adaptation came about, the people he mentioned were Jack Nicholson and Sean Connery. So I'm not quite sure how that would work, but interesting choices. He might have said that years before it actually happened. So, but that's kind of interesting.
Well, I actually do have something that I want to add and talk about, which is a bit of a thing that bugs me. So after this movie was, relatively, well, not really successful, but I guess successful enough, they end up making a Karen Cisco television show.
Yeah.
Which was made for ABC. I believe it came out in like 2003.
Mm-hmm.
And it was starring the hugely underrated Carla Gugino as Karen Cisco, who's great. I mean, it's got Bill Duke in it, who's also fantastic. And Robert Forster plays the Dennis Farina character, who we didn't mention before, who's great and everything. But Robert Forster plays that character. Great cast. The tone is very similar. It's actually produced by Jersey Films, I believe, who also produces Out of Sight.
Get Shorty.
The fact that this was canceled after, I think, 12 episodes, didn't even get to air all of its episodes on TV. It breaks my heart and infuriates me about what regular television was. And the reason it really bugs me is that it was just a little bit too soon. It was like it missed the window of being able to survive on network TV, but also, Justified comes out on FX in 2010, I believe. And this is 2003. And it's just a little too early, where at this point, FX, it was just putting out The Shield. So FX was only slowly starting to figure out what it was and what it could do. So it wasn't ready to go there. The USA Network ends up releasing Burn Notice, I think, like 2 years later.
Mhm.
which is also a show that takes place in Florida. It involves like an ex-spy. It's a really fun show, but regardless of anything, in my mind, a show like Karen Cisco could have fit into that wheelhouse as well. And so it's just a moment in time where the show didn't have the right home, and so it ends up failing. But it's a huge missed opportunity, and one that I still think about. I think about it so much that I actually bought all the episodes on bootleg DVD because it never came out on DVD or streaming. It doesn't exist.
Wow.
You can't find it anywhere. So I found some guy in Europe that was burning the show on the DVDs and bought it because I wanted to have it. And that's how much I enjoyed it. So it just really bugs me that it was just a show at a time and out of place and couldn't find a way to make it.
Yeah, and maybe it's the network aspect of it. Surely it was up against some stupid show on another channel and just wasn't in the right place at the right time. But
Yeah.
I've never watched it. I know of it. But I can
I can let you
imagine.
borrow the DVDs.
Yeah, that'd be great. I imagine that if it has that Elmore Leonard tone to it, it would have done very well on somewhere like FX. Yeah, absolutely. Or AMC. But yeah, that's tough. But that happens, it's the way it goes sometimes. That happens, and that's a good segue into explaining next week, because we wanted to start this with really kind of out of the gate something excellent. And it doesn't get much better than Out of Sight when it comes to Elmore Leonard adaptations. And we want to do a complete 180 next week and see how the other end works and go to what Elmore Leonard himself has considered the worst adaptation of one of his books. And it's a remake from an earlier version. And he said that he's responsible for making two of the worst films in film history, both based on the same book of his. So next week, we are going to talk about The Big Bounce, which if you haven't seen it, you're not alone. Nobody has seen it because it's widely considered a very terrible film.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, congratulations. But we will see it for you and talk about it.
Yeah, I will encourage you to watch it for this. This comes out in 2004. It's a George Armitage film. So 6 years later, and the tides have shifted with Elmore Leonard work because this is widely considered just awful. And it's a story of a small-time con artist and a Hawaiian real estate developer who just kind of team up to make 200 grand, basically. So it stars Owen Wilson, Morgan Freeman, and Gary Sinise, and also Sarah Foster. This is the first thing I've seen her in, and I don't think I've seen her in anything since, actually. It might have done for Sarah Foster the opposite of what Out of Sight did for all of these other people. Also in this film are Charlie Sheen and Vinnie Jones. Vinnie Jones has become sort of a movie throwdown favorite over the
Vinnie Jones
just because
deserved better. He deserved better. But
we did so many Guy Ritchie films. He's our mascot now.
yeah, you could say that in some ways this put the nail in the coffin of the Elmore Leonard renaissance of this particular crime verse that had been going on. But maybe that's good news because it ends up shifting to TV, and Justified comes out, 4 or 5 years later, and is in most people's minds who are fans of Elmore Leonard, it's kind of the most perfect adaptation that has ever been done of any of Elmore Leonard's work. It's one of my all-time favorite television shows. So I guess maybe we can thank The Big Bounce for that. I don't know. Maybe that.
Yeah, I hope so. I really need to get on the Justified boat. I'm so late to it. I've never watched it, but I've never heard a bad word about it. So I should really get into it. And great character actors, Oliphant, Walton Goggins. My God, it's amazing.
We could do a whole bonus show just about Justified, but we probably won't get into that. We'll try to stick to movies. But yes, it's as good as you heard, and you should see it.
So we're going to do The Big Bounce next week. And then let me just run down what we're going to do for the rest of Elmore Leonard month. The week after that, we're going to do Stick, which I'm very excited about because I've never seen it. Mike, you picked this one. Have you seen it?
I saw it probably on cable when I was very young. and I have
Okay.
very little memory of it. But it's an Elmore Leonard adaptation starring Burt Reynolds, and I thought that's a no-brainer. We got to give it a shot.
It's actually directed by Burt Reynolds too, which is
Mhm.
intriguing. Um, so I'm kind of excited for that. I've never seen it. It does feel like a cable movie from watching the trailer. I think it's going to be quite fun. And then after that, we're going to round out the month with another double feature, possibly the most successful Elmore Leonard adaptations outside of Out of Sight. Get Shorty and its follow-up, Be Cool. The second of which maybe not quite as good as the first. I haven't watched these in a long time, and I remember them both fondly. Especially the first one was a lot of fun. Definitely brought a more fun energy than Out of Sight did, like a lighter tone to it. So should be good.
I mean, again, it's interesting to think about what Out of Sight would have looked like if Barry Sonnenfeld had directed it.
Yeah.
If he directed with a similar tone that he did with Get Shorty, but
Mhm.
we'll never know. But that is an interesting thing.
It's really neat how all of these people kind of stick to Elmore Leonard. I mean, we've talked about so many people who did one thing and then years later return to it and do more work by Elmore Leonard. He really has sort of a loyal creative fan base. It's interesting. And we kind of see why in this film. I mean, whatever Soderbergh put on top of it, the writing's still there, and it's interesting. I mean, it's unique, and I can see why people would want to remake it for the screen. It's very cinematic.
Yeah, and I think that the best thing you can say about Elmore Leonard, I think, which why I really enjoy him, is that he writes really vivid characters, but there are very few throwaway characters, and nothing is very black and white. He throws nuance into that where you find yourself either sympathizing with criminals sometimes, or hardly anyone is played as truly dumb. White boy Bob aside, there's very few characters that are just purely stupid or silly. They all have their own motivations, and they're all driven, and some of them are very smart. And the cops and the villains almost have a respect for each other. So and it's obviously happens Out of Sight with Jack Foley and Karen Sisco, but that's what makes his writing so interesting. That they recognize almost that they're in the same boat, or that they're more similar than they care to admit. And there's something about that where he doesn't play down to anyone, and that's something about Out of Sight as well, and maybe why it wasn't that successful. I really think that Out of Sight's a very grown-up movie. It doesn't play down, it doesn't talk down to people. It's complex. It plays around with the chronology of the film. It jumps around in time. It's a very adult romance. It's about very adult motivations, and there's all these things that are going on that I don't think would play very well to children. You really have to sit with it and think about it. So I think that's might be part of it as well. That Elmore Leonard doesn't really write silly things, and I think that's what I think I like so much about Out of Sight. It felt like I was watching a grown-up movie.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I was thinking of other people who had adapted Elmore Leonard stuff, and I'm thinking about the tone. And I mean, Tarantino aside, that's sort of a more serious adaptation, though it's still comedic. But I think with that and Out of Sight, they're like art films in a way, whereas everything else feels very commercial and light almost. I could be totally wrong about that, but just in modern day, like starting with Jackie Brown, I think what Tarantino and Soderbergh do is they put that indie sort of skin over it, and it's not for kids.
But even that, it's like I think that almost every person making this movie would give you that sex scene, and it would be 5 minutes long, and it would be drawn out. And not only does Soderbergh not give it to you in any way, I mean, basically cuts out of it, because the sex scene is not important. It's the relationship that's important, and that's just a piece of it. And he plays with how that's cut as well, but doesn't give you any nudity, doesn't really give you anything. And he actually mentions that, I think it was the editor kind of asked, like, is that all that there is to it? And he said, yeah, I think part of it's his own discomfort in filming sex scenes, but I think that he recognizes that it's not really necessary for the movie, and it's not, because it's not really what the movie's about. But I find it hard to believe that many people would have had those two actors in those parts and not given you more. But I love the fact that they gave you less.
And the fact that, I mean, this just corroborates what I was saying, that the fact that he based that scene on Don't Look Now, a Nicholas Roeg film in the 70s, like the style of it just tells you all you need to know about him as a filmmaker. And that might not be for younger people, but those people are older now and they all love this film. So it worked out. It's the long game. All right. Well, I think that's it. We've done another one, and thanks everyone for listening. Be sure to check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/moviethrowdownpod. And we are Movie Throwdown Pod on social media everywhere. Find us on Letterboxd. We're actually Movie Throwdown there, and we want to really start doing more with that because it's basically the best social media platform there is, because it's about movies and it's cool. So follow us there, and until next week, so long, and we'll see you.